What happens when a business deal between two gigantic Japanese companies goes south? A legend is born. Join me in the exploration of the history of one of the most iconic consoles of the 90s, the Sony Playstation. My name is Kradion, and this is PACMAN'S REVENGE. In 1991, Sony announced that they were working with Nintendo on a brand new project, a CD-ROM expansion for the SNES. This project was expected to be a worldwide hit, and to make the triumphal entry of Sony in the video game market, alongside a leading company such as Nintendo. Yeah, you heard me. Sony and Nintendo, sworn rivals today, announced they would work together on a common project, as partners. So, what went wrong? And where is the result of the collaboration? To understand what happened, we need to backtrack a little to 1988 and pop an SNES open. If you carefully look inside the SNES, you will find a chip labeled Nintendo S-SMP. This chip is an audio processing unit powered by the SPC700, a sound synthesizer core developed by Ken Kutaragi of Sony. Then a design engineer, Kutaragi-san was deeply convinced that the video game market was about to go through a phenomenal resurgence driven by technological development, and that his company ought to play a leadership role in that market. The legend says that Kutaragi-san developed his intuition about the potential of the gaming market just by observing his young daughter playing the Famicom for hours, and observing her deep joy and involvement in the adventure developing on the screen. When Nintendo announced that they were looking for a new sound chip for their new 16-bit machine, Kutaragi-san knew this was his chance to convince his company. He engineered the basics of the SPC700 chip on his free time, with the intention of pushing his own company to strike a deal with Nintendo. Now, I doubt that the story went exactly like that. After all, there are several accounts of those days providing slightly different narratives. What is certain is that Kutaragi-san struggled to convince the management of Sony to realize his dream. You see, at the time, the management of Sony was convinced that video games were lame, childish somehow, and that entering the video game market would ultimately damage the reputation of the company. Kutaragi-san, however, was a resolute man. He persisted, and in the end, he could convince his management to strike a deal with Nintendo for the implementation of SPC700 in the SNES. But Kutaragi-san was not satisfied. He wanted more. He was firmly convinced that the video game market had a vast untapped potential, and that it would be a capital mistake not to exploit it. Even while working with Nintendo on the SNES sound chip, within Sony, gaming was still regarded as an inferior activity, something to be despised and looked down upon. However, despite the hostile atmosphere at Sony, Kutaragi-san managed to keep the two companies together, and in the end, the SNES sound chip project proved to be a great success. Castlevania, Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda. It's actually interesting to think that we owe all those memorable SNES tunes to a stubborn Sony engineer, isn't it? Invigorated by the accomplishment, Kutaragi-san approached once again the higher management at Sony, pursuing the authorization to start working on a new console, this time completely designed and manufactured by Sony. The executives, though, did not really share the enthusiasm of Mr. Kutaragi. The initial success of the SNES sound chip did not really sway their opinion on gaming. Moreover, one thing is designing and licensing a single sound chip. Another thing is to create a whole new hardware from the ground up to compete in a market dominated by few gigantic and well-established names. Sony president Muraoka felt the project proposed by Kutaragi-san was too ambitious and dangerous, and dismissed it very quickly. Little he knew that the perfect occasion for Sony came in 1989, when Nintendo approached them with a wild idea: develop a CD-ROM based Sony system to complement the capabilities of the SNES. The codename for the project? The Nintendo Playstation. Now, in order to understand the reason behind Nintendo's proposal, we need to talk about a massive technological revolution that was happening in those years. The dawn of the CD-ROM. Up until then, most gaming systems published their games in cartridges. Tapes and discs were mainly used in home computers. Cartridges are bulky. No matter how much you miniaturize them, you will still need a circuit board and a few chips in a plastic hull. As a consequence, cartridges are expensive to manufacture, and the amount of memory that you can fit there is quite limited, honestly. Even the biggest cartridges of the era could not fit more than a few megabytes of game code, which is a severe limitation in the complexity and size of games. On the other hand, CD-ROMs are a completely different beast. For one, their manufacturing process is extremely simple and inexpensive, and a single one can hold hundreds of megabytes of data, allowing for massively more complex games. It didn't take a visionary genius to see that CD-ROMs were the medium of the future, and that developers would flock in groups to the platforms supporting them. And several competitors of Nintendo started announcing CD-ROM based products of their own, either as standalone consoles, such as the Philips CDI, or as add-on modules to existing products, such as the Sega CD. Nintendo needed to stay ahead of the game, and put plans in motion to equip their SNES with a CD-ROM unit. And the choice of working with Sony, at the time a leading innovator in the development of the CD-ROM format, was more than obvious, and it was supported by the recent success of the SPC 700. The team of Kutaragi-san jumped on the task, and in a matter of months they developed the first prototypes of the Nintendo PlayStation. The unit was able to play CD-ROMs, and through the connection to the SNES, it was compatible with Nintendo cartridge games. This project was expected to consolidate the dominance of Nintendo in the home gaming market, and to project Sony at the forefront of the video game scene. The dream of Ken Kutaragi was finally becoming a reality. There was just one big problem. Sony wanted to control the licensing of games and media published on CD-ROMs for the new platform. This, obviously, was not acceptable for Nintendo, who feared losing control over its developer base. Nintendo was used to force very strict licensing schemes to their developers, effectively locking them to the platform and preventing them from porting their titles to competing systems. Leaving Sony in control of the licensing would effectively eliminate Nintendo's restrictions, significantly weakening their dominant position in the market. Nintendo tried to work around the problem and proposed Sony a different deal, where Nintendo would be in control of licensing and manufacturing of the supports, and the two companies would split revenues. Sony refused, as losing control over licensing of media stored on their CD-ROM format would actually remove the main reason to continue their part of the work. Nintendo knew that developers would prefer working on the new CD-ROM format, and in absence of a favorable deal with Sony, they decided to covertly approach Philips, Sony's biggest competitor, with a similar deal. Philips was about to announce their own CD-ROM based console, the CDI, and the possibility of licensing original Nintendo titles was just too good to pass, even under strict licensing terms. In reality, most of the Nintendo licensed titles for the CDI turned out to be quite lame, and they did not help the platform stand the test of time. But back then, nobody knew. So Nintendo ended up obtaining better licensing terms with Philips. The way they broke the news, however, remains today one of the most iconic plot twists of all gaming history. After several iterations of the hardware prototype and completely oblivious of Nintendo's machinations in the dark, Sony finally announced the Nintendo PlayStation in front of a raving crowd right before CES in 1991. The press release was a great success and expectations were high. After all, one of the leaders in consumer electronics just announced an enhancement for the most popular gaming console of all times. The hype was palpable, but short-lived. Less than 24 hours later, Nintendo released a statement announcing the development of a CD-ROM unit for the SNES, but with Philips, implicitly leaving Sony out of the picture. This was a major blow for Sony. Can you imagine? They basically made fools of themselves announcing the Nintendo PlayStation the day before. Also, Nintendo ditched them for a foreign company, breaking the unwritten rule of Japanese culture by which every Japanese company should prefer to work with a domestic partner over foreign ones. Sony, however, took it with class. On the surface. Gee, I'd like to know what happened in the next meeting at Sony. Anyway, Ken Kutaragi did not scrap the project. He went back to his management and convinced them that the best way to heal the wound was to complete the project. To paraphrase the Reaper, I think his argument to the president of Sony was,
"This time, I'll finish the job."
And the job he did finish. Kutaragi-san created and led the project PlayStation X, with the X allegedly standing for a reminder of the betrayal of Nintendo in those days of 1991. The team took the base Nintendo PlayStation hardware and turned it into a complete standalone console. The Nintendo prototype was abandoned, and today only a few units are known to exist. If you have one, hold on to it. Or send it to me, I don't mind. The new Sony console was announced in a keynote speech at CES in May 1994. From that day on, Ken Kutaragi ended up being known as the father of the PlayStation, and took a position of CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment. With a launch price of $299, the Sony PlayStation was initially targeted to a young adult segment of the population. The launch library of 17 titles, including some classics such as Ridge Racer and Rayman, actually contributed to create the appeal to this segment of the population. Along the years, however, the PlayStation demographics constantly shifted down towards teens and children, directly eroding the user base traditionally coveted by Nintendo. And it is easy to see why Sony's marketing was pushing the PlayStation as the definitive game player. A 32-bit CPU running at 33.9 MHz, a graphic coprocessor system able to render in excess of 350,000 polygons, advanced effects such as transparency and fog, native support for CDs. It's clear that the creation of Kutaragi was set to become one of the most powerful machines of its time. The design of the controller itself was seen as revolutionary. You see, the PlayStation controller was the first one to significantly deviate from the traditional brick design that was popularized by the Atari 2600. Seen as weird in the beginning, the PlayStation controller was ultimately loved by a generation of gamers for its ergonomic grip, its shoulder buttons, and the level of control it gave them. Fun fact, did you know that the selection of symbols for the keys of the PlayStation controller was deliberate and actually followed a precise logic? The triangle represents a point of view, and it was used in the context of navigation. The square looks like a document, and it was intended to access in-game menus and documents. The circle and X mean, respectively, yes and no. Fun fact number 2. Did you know that in the Western world they swapped the meaning of the circle and the X because for us it is more natural to consider the bottom button as the main one? Fun fact number 3. Did you know that in the Western world pads are approximately 10% larger than Japanese ones to account for our bigger hands? Okay, no more fun facts. Many other titles made the success of the Sony PlayStation, including Spyro the Dragon, Tomb Raider, Oddworld, Final Fantasy VII. I love this one. Tekken 3, Gran Turismo 2, Silent Hill, Resident Evil 2, Metal Gear Solid, and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It is difficult to overstate the impact that the Sony PlayStation had on the video game market and on popular culture. The PlayStation was the first console ever to sell more than 100 million units. Its various incarnations arguably won the console wars against Nintendo for 2 generations of devices, and the Sony PlayStation was single-handedly responsible for blowing Sega out of business. Sometimes I wonder how the console market would look like today if Sony and Nintendo would have continued the project. Would we have a Sony console at all? Would Sega be still in business? I don't know. The only things I know for sure is that this story gave us an interesting tale to tell, a rare prototype to look at, and countless hours of fun across more than 2 decades. That is more than enough for me. My name is Kradion, and this was PACMAN'S Revenge.